Hi, thanks for tuning in. I'm Michaela Jefferson, a reporter at Mediatel News, and in this next session you'll see me chatting with George Osborn, who is Head of Communications at Ukie. Ukie is the only trade body for the UK's games and interactive entertainment industry, representing businesses from small startups to large multinational companies. It's also behind the recent Games for Carers initiative, which saw companies including EA, Xbox, and Sega gift NHS staff free access to more than 85,000 video games to say thank you for their work during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. George will be talking about this, as well as the evolution of the quote-unquote gamer and the opportunities for advertisers in gaming now. Enjoy! Hi George, how are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you very much. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, yeah. How are you finding lockdown?
It's pretty boring by now. It feels like every single day is broadly the same, except I've gotten a little bit further in the game I'm playing, which is Disco Elysium. So that's about the only thing that I'm using to actually track my progress from day to day. So it's a real positive right now.
I haven't heard of that game before.
It's an RPG where you're a detective trying to solve a murder. So it's quite interesting. It's BAFTA award winning as well. So it's very highbrow.
Oh, that's cool. All right. Thanks again for joining us today. I'm just going to jump straight into our questions because we've only got 15 minutes.
Sure.
I just kind of want to start into, we're going to be hearing a lot today about how gaming and esports is adapting to the current pandemic that we're going through. And I just wonder, from your perspective as the trade body for the gaming industry, how are you faring and how is the industry adapting to coronavirus?
Well, I think the main thing to say is the industry is pretty resilient, actually. It's not to say that there hasn't been an impact on the industry. There are bits like the games media and games events companies who have obviously been affected in the way that a lot of traditional companies have. But overall, the feedback we've gotten from most of our developers and publishers is they're working mostly as normal. Game development is done on laptops and PCs, and after a shift to remote work where we heard a lot of stories about companies spending a lot of money on IKEA furniture for their employees, most people have carried on working. And I think for the industry now, it's less about the sort of the immediate short term where people may have concerns. The longer term problems about where do you get investment from if you're not able to meet investors face to face at events? How do you keep money flowing into the business over that longer period of time? It is of concern. But with a combination of being an industry that's pretty innovative and technically flexible, and the fact that, let's truth be told, a lot of people have decided to play video games during their period in lockdown, we're actually in quite good health, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think you're probably one of the best industries to be facing this kind of crisis, really.
Yeah, I mean, we are aware, we work with a lot of the other creative industries too, and the challenges that film and TV and music have faced, we've got an enormous amount of sympathy with them. Those must be really difficult challenges to negotiate, and it's right that the focus is falling on those at this particular moment in time. So for us, it's more been an opportunity about what can we do as a sector to help as many people as possible during the crisis as we can, while also keeping ourselves going.
Well, that's a good segue, because I know that you have been involved with this Games for Carers
That's the one.
Games for Carers initiative. Tell us a bit more about that, because it's obviously a really impressive gesture.
Sure. So what happened was I was doing what every true professional does. I was looking at Facebook one day, and I spotted in a games industry chat that a journalist called Chris Scullion was in the conversation. And when games journalists get games to review, they're sent codes which they can pop into their console to download the game for free. And he said, I have some spare codes. Does anyone know any NHS workers? I'd like to go and just give them out to some people. And we saw loads of people in the industry who were really interested in it. So we then had a completely serendipitous chat with one of our members called Keymailer, who are a site that's built to distribute codes to journalists normally. And in the course of a crazy 3-week period, we built a website that was designed to allow only people with NHS emails to log into it and get a free game from some company within the UK video games industry. So we ended up having 80 80 different companies across the UK game sector, including companies like Codemasters and Sega, provide, in the end, I think it was over 100,000 game codes. And on the first day we had over 500,000 people come and visit the site. We were sort of trying to parcel the codes out as carefully as possible so they'd be available for a few weeks, but on the first day I think we ended up having over 15,000 free games distributed in the course of just that first day. And the campaign's coming to an end now. All of the console games unfortunately long gone, even though the campaign only launched very sort of late in April. But we've just been happy to do our bit for it. We wanted to do something for all of those people working so hard on our behalf, and this seemed like a great way to just do something practical.
The popularity of this initiative kind of proves that judging by old stereotypes, you might not necessarily suspect that NHS workers would be hugely interested in games, but those stereotypes don't really apply to the new gaming and esports and entertainment atmosphere that we've got going. So what is a modern day gamer?
That's a really good question. I mean, is a modern day gamer even called a gamer? We've had this conversation internally, is that when you say gamer, those old stereotypes pop up. So when you're talking to someone and you say, are you a gamer? Lots of people go, no. And then you go, but have you got a mobile game on your phone that you play in your lunch break, or when you're sitting at the office when you're bored in a meeting? People go, yeah, I do actually. So right, so you play games. And that's basically where we've gotten to, is we've realized, through our research and through others' research, there's about 37 million people in the UK playing games. Most of them are actually adults. The vast majority of people who play games are now adults. Nesta, a couple of years ago, did a piece of research to basically identify the archetype of what's a player in the UK. And what they found was that essentially it's a 43-year-old woman. Like a huge number of games, especially with the rise of mobile games over the last decade. What's happened is, when you look at the overall games market, the demographics have transformed. So when you account for all of those mobile games, it comes to about 50-50 in terms of gender split. It's across pretty much all age groups, except for the very sort of oldest demographics who didn't grow up with games. It's been transforming into something that was initially a very entertaining niche hobby for younger people into something that everyone does. So many people play across society now that games are kind of integral to it. So it's an interesting time, to say the least, to be in the industry.
It's much more like community and social based event than it used to be in the past as well, right?
Yeah, precisely. So, a lot of the things that bring people together about games is they're great spaces to interact with your friends and to build a community, especially with online games. You've probably seen it with Fortnite and the massive in-game concerts and Star Wars stuff that they've been having going on. They've become those spaces where you come together. But also, with the widening of the demographic, there's just been so many different types of games launched that appeal to so many different audiences. So, when people tend to talk about games, we talk about FIFA, we talk about Fortnite, because those are the ones that commonly come up. But if you look across all of the stores in the UK, if you look across Steam, the app stores, the console stores, there's 900,000 games currently available for download in the UK. And if you look at the console stores and those big price releases, there's at least 3,000 available. On a PC, it's about 30,000. So you have so much variety, and we cater to so many different audiences, that what games is really widespread, which is both a challenge, because trying to explain it quickly and easily becomes really difficult, but it's also an enormous opportunity. All of the audiences are there. You've just got to work out how you tap into them.
What about esport audiences? That must be a bit more of a niche audience.
That is still a bit more of a niche audience, but I know it's developing. I mean, if you look at the research by the likes of Newzoo, you're talking about probably at least hundreds of millions of people tuning into esports content at least once a month, with I think it was about 150 million or so doing so on a much more regular basis. And I think one of the key elements of the current coronavirus crisis has been the fact that lots of different sports organisations have actually jumped online to have competitive games tournaments as a way of filling gaps in their schedule. So I know that F1 have been running charity celebrity races where you've been having things like famous England cricketers going up against actual Formula One drivers. The Betis Seville derby was played out between two of the players for each of the clubs in FIFA. And there was a Football Manager Cup featuring the English Football League, where 54 of the teams in the EFL appointed virtual football managers, and they had a knockout tournament together to raise money for Mind. So it's been a great opportunity, in a sense, for this crisis, for games to show that where those opportunities aren't able to be had in the real world, you can experience something pretty similar in the digital.
Mm. So, I mean, according to like recent data, the gaming sector is huge now, supposedly bigger than music and video combined, and valued at around, well, almost 4 billion, I believe, in the UK. Are you surprised at all? Because we're going to be talking about advertising in games a lot during this digital event. Are you surprised that advertisers, haven't jumped on game advertising earlier?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's interesting for two reasons. So I think the first one is about why there hasn't been the opportunity in certain platforms. So I think the main reason has been that actually it's been quite difficult to get your adverts into like a PC or a console game. Until fairly recently, there was no equivalent sort of programmatic ad tech where you could just easily insert adverts into games. But there are now companies popping up who are starting to provide those services, and one of the companies that did that actually helped out with a government campaign to get stay home save lives messages into leading video games. So players who were driving around in Dirt Rally 2 were seeing those messages during the absolute start of the lockdown. So first of all, I think the capability wasn't there in certain elements of it. But then I think on the other side of it, if you look at mobile and you look at the mobile advertising space, I think one of the really interesting things is that people don't realize that games powered a huge amount of that ecosystem. If you go back to 2012 and Facebook creating the app install ad, one of the reasons why they created that advertising unit was there was a huge demand from mobile game publishers who were shifting their games from paid to free models to generate as many installs as possible. So 2012, that was the year of the Facebook ad install ad, and then you had Candy Crush Saga, which is obviously still one of the biggest games around at the moment, making $1 billion each year, and Clash of Clans, the big release by Supercell. That all came out that year, and games kind of powered that mobile advertising ecosystem and gave it a lot of a push to turn it into what it is today. So I think, in terms of why the opportunity hasn't necessarily been tapped into, I would say probably the biggest reason has just simply been infrastructure. But I think now that is being fixed, and I think now that you look at a lot of games shifting to service models, especially sort of this idea of having constantly running online multiplayer, which you need to find a way to pay for. If you've got these big audiences of players, I think more companies are going to look at this as an opportunity. So, I think there's still definitely room for it to grow, and I think it's an exciting opportunity for a lot of companies.
Do you think at all? I think one of the problems that maybe comes up from a consumer perspective with game advertising, particularly in-game advertising, when we talk about the likes of an F1 game with real advertisers on the billboards, is that these games are very expensive.
Yep.
And therefore, is it intrusive of advertisers to come into a space that's very actively engaged? It's not a passive experience in the way that TV and film is. And you're paying a lot for those games. Is it right for advertisers to look at in-game advertising like that? And if so, are there some ground rules to be aware of?
So, I think the first thing is to think a little bit about that dynamic, because, if you compare it to the mobile game space, there is the entire hyper-casual genre, which is entirely funded by advertising. The whole genre exists to work in tandem with advertisers, because that's the way, in these very sort of short play sessions, it makes the most sense to monetize, because you have natural breaks in play where you put adverts in. With these bigger full price releases, I think that there's two things to say about it. So I think the first one is that even though most games do release at a full price still, or especially in terms of those big name console releases, there are an increasing number of games that are trying to stay on the market for much longer and have players engaged over a longer period of time, so they can keep making money, for the fairly mundane reason that it costs a lot of money to have your servers going, to keep your team going, to create all kinds of content. And then at the other end of it, companies are experimenting with business models. Fortnite, for example, biggest game in the world, is completely free to play, free to download. You have to pay for the battle pass if you want to get more content more quickly, but it's actually completely free to play. And I think that's where the opportunity starts existing. So in those games which have an upfront price, I think the general advice is to make sure that you put yourself naturally into the game. So in things like F1, where there are naturally advertising billboards, on an F1 track, that's a very natural place to advertise. People don't feel aggrieved by it because it fits with the reality that they're in. Whereas if you suddenly start having splash screens coming up midway through a lap, you're going to start annoying people. So make sure you think about that context. And then I think on the other side, think about the opportunity around a lot of these free-to-play games. You know, if more companies are going towards this model, they do need to find additional supplementary ways to advertise. And if you can find a natural way to appeal to the audience in there, you might do pretty well. The other thing as well, I'm just going to mention about this in terms of in-game advertising, it's something that advertisers might like, is actually the PEGI age rating system. So if you're working with a console game, you actually know what that game is rated for. So you can use that as a way to help you start segmenting your audience out a little bit in a natural, age-appropriate and GDPR-compliant way. You know, so you can start, instead of looking at websites and going, what's going on here in terms of how users are being segmented, you can use that PEGI age rating as a bit of a guarantor that a certain kind of audience might be excluded. So if you're starting to advertise a certain product and you know it's 18 plus, there are 18 plus PEGI age rated games, and that's where you should be gaming. Whereas if you're looking towards a younger audience, you might be looking towards games that have the 12 or the 7 bracket, where you know they've gone through a stringent approval process to be age appropriate for that particular age category, and you might be able to find a way to advertise in there. So that's an interesting extra angle. Okay,
that's all really interesting stuff. And we are almost out of time. So just before we end, what's your focus? What's Ukie's focus for the rest of the year and beyond?
Well, our principal focus is always to make the UK the best place to make, play and sell games. That's our kind of mission statement. You know, what we've got coming down the pipe. So we've got our virtual trade mission to Germany in August. We normally do one to Gamescom each year, but naturally the physical event isn't happening. So we're currently in the process of planning that. We've got a couple more interesting consumer campaigns coming up. We've been running a campaign all year called Get Smart About Play, which is all about encouraging parents to use family settings on their devices to limit playtime and spend. So we're going to be doing a little bit more around that, and we'll just keep on doing the work we do, talking to the government, talking to the press, and talking to people like yourself about what's going on in games.
All right, thanks so much for this, George. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and have a good rest of lockdown.
Thank you very much. You too.